Heat a box and look inside. It glows dull red, then orange, then white, and the color is a thermometer. The hotter the walls, the bluer the light, in one curve that every furnace and every star obeys. A century ago that curve broke physics. Count the light waves in the box the classical way, and each one gets an equal share of the heat, but there are ever more waves as you go bluer, so the box should blaze with infinite ultraviolet. It does not. That was the crime scene. The culprit was quantized energy, and it founded 100 years of physics. Now here is the sharper version of the same charge, and it is aimed at this book. An earlier draft of this corpus called its own foundation classical, a deterministic gas of little spinning rotors, and then wrote down the quantum blackbody curve anyway. That looks exactly like planting evidence. Take the quantum factor out and you get the catastrophe back. Leave it in and you have bought an answer the axioms never paid for. So which is it? Was the evidence planted at the scene? Or was it there in the axioms the whole time, and only the label on the file was forged? This chapter is the trial, and the verdict turns on a single word. One thing before we begin. Advaita Chakra Theory is a speculative, exploratory framework, not established, peer-reviewed physics. Much of what follows is honest conjecture that still needs validation. Watch it in that spirit as ideas to test, argue with, and refute. Let us state the accusation properly, because it is precise and it deserves respect. A gas of classical oscillator shares its energy equally. Every mode gets caped to whatever its frequency. Count how many modes fit in the box up to a given frequency, and the number grows like frequency squared, so the energy in the box climbs without limit and the total diverges. That is the Rayleigh-Jeans law, and it is not a mistake. It is the correct classical answer. Reality gives you something else. The Planck curve differs from Rayleigh-Jeans by exactly one factor, the Bose occupation, 1 over e to the h stroke omega over kBt minus 1. That factor starves the high-frequency modes and cures the divergence. It is the whole difference between a glowing box and an exploding one. So if the chakra substrate really were a classical rotor gas, that factor would be contraband. Smuggled in. The corpus's own self-audit flagged it, in those words, as the single clearest unearned quantum step in the whole theory. And I want to be clear that this is the corpus prosecuting itself. Nobody outside caught it. The defense, which is what the rest of this video lays out, is not that the smuggling was justified. It is that the substrate was never classical in the first place, and that once you take the axiom seriously, the Bose factor stops being evidence to be planted and becomes a theorem to be read off. Start where chapter 2 left the substrate. Take the rotor lattice in its locked ground state and expand the Hamiltonian to quadratic order about that lock. It falls apart into independent normal modes, one for each lattice wave vector, with frequencies set by the master dynamical matrix, inertia, stiffness, and the locking term. Along the exact flat direction, the direction the locking does not punish, the mode is gapless and acoustic. Those are the Goldstone quanta, and they are the ones that will play the role of photons. Their frequency is a cosine band. At long wavelength it straightens into a linear, relativistic cone with the emergent light speed of chapter 3, and at short wavelength the finite lattice spacing bends the branch downward and stops it dead at the edge of the Brillouin zone. Remember that ceiling? Its height is 2 times the cone speed over the lattice spacing, and in energy terms it sits at the same Lorentz violation scale ELV that shows up in every other sector of this book. Now impose the axiom the prosecution forgot. Axiom A.2 says each rotor's angular momentum is an integer conjugate to a compact phase. That is not decoration. That is what quantization means. A classical rotor would carry a continuous angular momentum and commuting variables. The discreteness of the angular momentum is h stroke. Carry it through the diagonalization, and each mode is not a classical oscillator that can hold any energy at all, but a quantum oscillator on an integer ladder, h stroke omega times n plus a half. And the integer n is inherited mode by mode from the integer angular momentum of the rotors underneath. There is no second quantization postulate for the radiation field anywhere in this chapter. The field quanta are integer because the rotors are integer. With the ladder in hand, the thermal step is short, and I am going to be scrupulous about which part of it is ours and which part is a textbook's. Put one mode in contact with a heat bath at temperature T and ask for its partition function, the sum over all its allowed energies, each weighted by the Boltzmann factor. Because the allowed energies are a ladder of evenly spaced rungs, that sum is a geometric series. Geometric series have a closed form you learned at school. Differentiate its logarithm and out drops the mean occupation of the mode 1 over e to the h stroke omega over kBt minus 1. The Bose-Einstein distribution. Now, as a formula that is completely standard. It is Bose in 1924 and Einstein after him, and we tag it standard and hand the credit back. What is not standard, what the substrate actually supplies, is the thing that made the sum a geometric series in the first place, the integer ladder. Take the ladder away. Let the angular momentum be continuous, as a genuinely classical rotor would. The sum becomes an integral over continuous phase space, the mean occupation collapses to kBt over h stroke omega, and you are back in Rayleigh genes with the catastrophe intact. So the pivot in this whole chapter is not at the Bose factor, it is one line earlier at the ladder. Bose statistics is a consequence of quantization, and quantization is an axiom, not a factor inserted downstream to buy the right answer. Delete the word classical from the old description, and the borrowing turns into an entailment. Now assemble the spectrum. Weight each mode by its energy quantum, and by how many of those quanta the heat bath puts in it, and multiply by how many modes there are at that frequency. That last piece is the density of states, and it is where the substrate's own emergent light speed walks into the thermodynamics. Modes fill the Brillouin zone, count them in a box. Use the long wavelength branch where frequency is the cone speed times wave vector, differentiate, and the density of states grows as frequency squared divided by the cone speed cubed. One honest caveat. That count carries a factor of 2 for the two transverse polarizations of a massless gauge field, and that fact is inherited from the emergent Maxwell theory of part 5, not derived here. It is the one structural input this calculation takes from outside its own chapter. Put the three pieces together and you have Planck's law, written with this theory's own emergent light speed rather than a light speed put in by hand. That is audit row R015, tagged closed and derived. The classical limit is not lost, it is contained at low frequency, the whole thing collapses to Rayleigh genes, and the catastrophe is just the failure of that limit at high frequency. Integrate over all frequencies, and you get the Stefan Boltzmann law, energy density going as temperature to the fourth, with the radiation constant fixed entirely by h stroke and the emergent cone speed. Extremize it, and you get Wien's displacement law, the peak sitting at about 2.821 times kBt, and the entropy density goes as temperature cubed, which is the same photon gas entropy that drives the adiabatic cooling in chapter 13's cosmology. Everything so far is recovery. Now the part that is this substrate's own. That Stefan Boltzmann integral cheated slightly, it ran the frequencies up to infinity. Real lattice modes do not do that. The dispersion bends below the cone, and the spectrums at the zone boundary. Both effects strip weight out of the high-frequency tail relative to the ideal Planck curve. Carry the leading correction through the density of states and reintegrate, and the energy density picks up a correction term, negative and proportional to temperature to the sixth power. Negative because finite spacing removes high-frequency modes rather than adding them. And look at the expansion parameter. It is the thermal energy divided by ELV squared, the same ELV, h stroke times the cone speed over the lattice spacing, that shifts the double-slit fringe in chapter 27, that rescales the graviton dispersion, that dresses every other sector in this book. One spacing, one scale every sector. Two honesty notes attached to this. First, the coefficient out front gamma is a pure number of order 1 and it is not computed. The leading expansion fixes its sign and its scale but not its value. Getting the value needs the full Brillouin zone integral with the true polarization sum and the zone edge handled exactly. That is a finite, well-posed calculation that no paper in this corpus currently provides. Second, and this is the structural point, because the deviation inherits the one substrate scale, it is correlated with every other sector's deviation, not independent of them. Hold on to that, because in a moment it is the only thing that saves the prediction from being useless. Put real numbers in. Take the cosmic microwave background, the most precise blackbody known to science, at 2.725 keV, a thermal energy of about 2.35 times 10 to the minus 4 electron volts. Stefan Boltzmann gives a radiant energy density of about 4.2 times 10 to the minus 14 joules per cubic meter and a spectral peak near 160 gigahertz. That is the ordinary blackbody correctly reproduced. Now size the lattice term. Use the loosest bound the sky allows on the lattice spacing, about 2 times 10 to the minus 26 meters, and ELV comes out at roughly 1 times 10 to the 19 electron volts, which is 10 to the 10 gigaelectron volts. The correction ratio is then about 6 times 10 to the minus 46. And here is the passage I most want you to hear. That lattice spacing is not derived. Nothing in this chapter and nothing in this book calculates it. It is a parameter bounded from above by observation, and the Lorentz violation scale is bounded along with it. If instead you choose the spacing to be the Planck length, then ELV is the Planck energy and the ratio falls further to around 10 to the minus 64. That is a choice, not a result. This theory does not predict that its lattice spacing is the Planck length. It permits it. Either way, the fractional deviation of the CMB spectrum from an ideal Planck curve is unmeasurably small, as it had better be, since Feres confirms a pure Planck shape to a few parts in 10 to the 5th. Say it plainly, the single-sector lattice term is undetectable. The blackbody curve on its own is not a test of this theory. Two things here are honestly incomplete, and they are of very different weight. The light one is gamma, the uncomputed coefficient we just met, a well-posed calculation waiting for someone to do it. The heavy one is this. The Bose formula assumed the canonical distribution. It assumed the modes have already reached thermal equilibrium at temperature T. That the deterministic rotor dynamics actually relaxes to the Gibbs distribution is not proved anywhere in this book. It is Axiom A.2, statistical typicality, and it is assumed. And it is the same single assumption that underlies the Born rule in chapters 2007 and 28 and the Coid mass relation in chapter 22. Chapter 37 argues those are one frontier, not three. What would close it is a substrate-level proof that coarse-grained rotor observables take their Gibbs typical values for generic initial data with a computed relaxation rate. Nobody has it. But notice how cleanly it separates from the Planck closure. The quantization that gives you Bose statistics is axiomatic and settled, and only the approach to equilibrium is open. And one retraction while we are here. An earlier draft regularized the zero-point sum by zeta function continuation and inherited the notorious minus 1/12. That step is unnecessary and misleading. On a lattice, the sum is finite because the Brillouin zone is finite. The minus 1/12 is an artifact of shrinking the spacing to zero prematurely, of throwing away the very cutoff that makes the theory well defined. The divergence it appears to cure was never verdict. The charge was that a classical substrate produced a quantum blackbody curve by sleight of hand, and the charge fails, but not because the smuggling was justified. It fails because the substrate was never classical. Integer angular momentum is quantization. It is Axiom A.2, and the whole Planck spectrum follows from it as a theorem: the ladder, the geometric series, the Bose factor, temperature to the fourth, the Wien peak, the entropy. All recovered with the emergent light speed sitting where a hand-inserted light speed used to sit. The correction to the record is one word. Delete classical, and the borrowing becomes an entailment. What is genuinely new here is small and honest, a negative temperature to the sixth suppression of the high-frequency tail, set by the one substrate scale, with its coefficient uncomputed and its size 46 orders of magnitude below anything we can measure in the microwave background. So the blackbody curve's real job in this book is the negative test, not the positive one, and the positive content lives in the correlation across sectors, assembled much later. And notice what has quietly happened by the end of this chapter. One substrate, one Hamiltonian, one Goldstone field, seen 3 times thermally populated. It is the blackbody. Populated by a horizon, it is Hawking radiation. Populated by nothing at all is the Casimir energy. Next, keep the vacuum populated by nothing at all. Add up the zero-point energy of every mode, and ask why that colossal number has not curled the universe into a ball smaller than an atom. A word of acknowledgement. This work was inspired in part by the non-dual teachings of Sri Narayana Guru, that the creator, the creation, and the substance of creation are fundamentally one. Symbols from the Hindu tradition, the Sudarshan chakra and the Shiva linga, suggested the analogies behind the chakra model. They are acknowledged as philosophical and symbolic inspiration. The physics stands on its own. Thank you for watching. If this made you think, please like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps this work reach the people who will argue with it properly. And do leave a comment, tell me where you think I am wrong. Every chapter in this series names its own kill tests, and the objections are the point. The book and the next chapter are linked below. Until then, one substance and how far it reaches.